The boardroom smelled faintly of rain and old ambition. It was the kind of morning where the city below looked polished, yet fragile, like it could shatter under its own reflection. At the far end of the table sat Celeste Arden, 60 years old, and every inch the woman who had built her empire from silence and resolve. Her silver hair framed a face that had learned the cost of grace, every wrinkle a story, every pause a negotiation. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise, it steadied the room. But that morning, as she waited for the board's vote, there was a flicker of something different behind her calm eyes. Doubt. The board had gathered to challenge her decision to invest in a new initiative led by Lila Rowan, a 29-year-old rising strategist whose ideas were as daring as they were divisive. Celeste saw herself in the young woman. Restless, idealistic, hungry for purpose more than profit. The others saw only risk. Lila's projections are visionary, Celeste said, breaking the tension. And vision is what built Arden Group, not fear. Charles Denton, the chairman, folded his hands. With respect, Celeste, she's inexperienced. The market doesn't forgive inexperience. Neither does time, Celeste replied softly. Her words hung like incense. The vote proceeded. 6 against, 1 abstained, and Celeste herself stood as the only yes. But when the numbers settled, she didn't look defeated. She turned toward the window, watching the city lights blur into the glass, and whispered under her breath, "Sometimes you choose the person, not the profit." It was the moment that would unravel everything. That quiet defiance, the kind that doesn't make headlines but rewrites destinies, marked the beginning of a storm no one in that boardroom could yet feel. Lila Rowan didn't expect to become anyone's cause. She had joined Arden Group believing she'd have to fight for every inch of space. She never imagined the most powerful woman in the building would fight for her instead. When the news spread that Celeste Arden had overruled the board to back her proposal, Lila became both admired and envied. The hallways buzzed with whispers. She must have something on the CEO. But what she had, truthfully, was Celeste's faith. A rare, quiet gift that felt too heavy to carry. Their first real conversation outside the office wasn't about strategy or projections. It was at a late dinner in a half-empty restaurant where the soft jazz played like a heartbeat in the background. Celeste had insisted. "You've worked hard enough to deserve one meal without spreadsheets," she'd said with a smile that could warm marble. Across the table, Lila studied her. This woman who carried power like a second skin. "What made you believe in me?" she finally asked. Celeste's gaze softened. "Because I saw myself before the world made me careful." That answer stayed with Lila long after the night ended. But beneath the admiration was unease. She didn't want to be a reflection of Celeste's past or redemption for her regrets. She wanted her own story, her own scars, her own mistakes. And somewhere between those long evenings and shared silences, a line began to blur. Celeste found comfort she hadn't known she was missing. Lila found a tension that felt both empowering and suffocating. In a world obsessed with appearances, neither woman noticed that affection, unspoken, unmeasured, was quietly reshaping their lives. By early autumn, the corridors of Arden Group carried a new sound. Quiet suspicion, the kind that drifts through glass walls and polite smiles. Lila Rowan noticed it first in the way conversations hushed when she entered, the way colleagues measured their words around her, as though every sentence might end up on Celeste Arden's desk. Celeste tried to shield her from it, but power has a way of attracting noise. Rumors began to slip between boardrooms and press dinners. Stories that painted Celeste not as a visionary, but as a woman distracted. "She's lost her edge," someone murmured in an elevator. "Or maybe she's just lost herself," came another voice. Celeste heard the whispers. She had spent her entire career learning to survive them. But this time, it was different. It wasn't her reputation she worried about. It was Lila's. The younger woman carried ambition like sunlight, and Celeste feared that being chosen by her would cast too long a shadow. Still, Celeste didn't regret her choice. In every meeting, she defended Lila's project with a composure that unsettled the board. Her voice remained even, her tone deliberate, her logic sharp. But underneath that calm exterior, the lines on her face deepened. Nights grew longer. Her penthouse, once filled with the comfort of solitude, now felt like a museum of second thoughts. Lila, meanwhile, was torn. She admired Celeste's courage, yet dreaded what it meant. Every success she achieved came wrapped in whispers that it wasn't hers alone. The respect she'd worked for began to taste bitter. One evening, as she left the office, she caught her reflection in the glass doors, her own face half lit, half shadowed. Behind her, Celeste's office light glowed like a watchful star. Lila turned away, a small ache blooming in her chest. For the first time, she wondered if being chosen by greatness could also mean being trapped by it. Celeste Arden had spent decades learning how to be admired without being known. But admiration, she discovered, is a fragile currency when affection begins to take its place. Their connection deepened quietly, through late-night calls, shared glances in meetings, the unspoken comfort of someone who understood without explanation. To the world, it looked like mentorship. To them, it was something more complicated, something neither dared to name. One night, after another board confrontation left Celeste visibly exhausted, Lila walked into her office uninvited. The city's skyline burned amber behind them, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Celeste sat at her desk, her fingers trembling over a half-signed document. "Why do you keep fighting for me?" Lila asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Celeste looked up, her expression weary yet kind. "Because everyone else is fighting against you. Someone should stand beside you." Lila's heart twisted. "But you're losing everything because of me." Celeste smiled faintly. "Then at least I'm losing it for something that still feels alive." The words lingered like perfume in the air, subtle, haunting. Lila felt her pulse quicken, not from romance but from fear. She knew this kind of devotion came at a price she couldn't afford to pay. That night, as she rode home in silence, her phone buzzed with a message from Aiden Vale, the man she had once promised her heart to but had slowly drifted from. "We need to talk." For the first time in months, Lila felt something stir that Celeste's attention could never replace. A longing for simplicity, for youth, for love unburdened by power. She looked out at the city lights blurring past her window, torn between two worlds. One built on admiration, the other on desire. And as the car turned a corner, she whispered to herself, "What am I doing?" Somewhere high above, Celeste Arden stood by her window, staring at the same city, unaware that the first cracks in her carefully built devotion had already begun to form. Aiden Vale waited outside the cafe, where he and Lila Rowan had first met. The same small corner spot that smelled of roasted beans and rain-soaked pavement. He hadn't changed much, still restless, still charming in a way that seemed both sincere and temporary. When Lila arrived, she hesitated before sitting. Months apart had turned familiar things into strangers. The sound of his voice, the curve of his smile, it all felt like echoes from a different lifetime. "I heard about the board vote," Aiden said carefully, his tone more curious than proud. "They say you're the CEO's favorite." Lila winced. "That's what they all say. No one talks about the work anymore." Aiden leaned back, studying her. "Do you still want this? Corporate wars, board politics, being someone's symbol?" The question stung because it carried truth. Celeste Arden had believed in her, yes, but that belief had become a cage gilded in good intentions. Lila had started to forget who she was before Celeste's influence began shaping every corner of her world. Meanwhile, back in the glass tower, Celeste stared at the empty chair across from her. Lila's absence was louder than the city's hum. She told herself it was just professional concern, but deep down it was something older, a loneliness that had worn too many disguises over the years. That evening, Grace Halden, her assistant, found Celeste standing by the window again. "Still thinking about her?" Grace asked softly. Celeste didn't answer right away. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, older somehow. "When you've spent your life making choices, you start to forget what it feels like to be chosen," she finally said. Grace's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time you remember." But remembering meant risking the one thing Celeste had never allowed: vulnerability. And as she turned away from the city, she couldn't shake the quiet ache that perhaps, this time, her heart had chosen what her legacy could not keep. Days passed with polite emails and postponed meetings. Celeste Arden, once the axis of every decision, began to notice how silence crept into her calendar. The board didn't challenge her openly anymore, they simply waited. Waiting, after all, was the most elegant form of rebellion. Lila, meanwhile, was caught between two promises. The one she had made to herself to succeed, and the unspoken one she had made to Celeste when she let that faith change her life. Aiden's return had reopened something tender but dangerous. His questions followed her everywhere. Who are you without her belief? One late afternoon, Lila walked into Celeste's office to resign from the project. She had rehearsed the words all day, but when she saw Celeste sitting behind her desk, calm and composed as ever, they dissolved on her tongue. "I think it's time I move on," she finally managed. "The project can survive without me." Celeste didn't speak. She closed the file in front of her slowly, her fingers tracing the edge as though memorizing it. Is this about them? Them? Lila frowned. The board? The press? Or him? The silence stretched like glass about to break. Lila's throat tightened. Maybe it's about me, Celeste. For the first time in months, Celeste's voice trembled. You think walking away will make it easier to breathe, but it won't. You'll find his warmth comforting until you remember the cold it came from. Lila turned toward the door. I need a life that's mine. Celeste's words followed her like a shadow. And what if the life that's yours breaks the one I built for you? Outside, the city roared, cars, voices rang, everything moving forward except the two of them. When Lila left that evening, Celeste remained seated in silence. She wasn't angry, she was hollow. For the first time in her career, she had made a choice the world couldn't measure. One that left her with nothing to defend except her own heart. That night, Grace Halden found her again, staring out the window. She's gone, Celeste whispered, and the company will never forgive me for caring. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe it's not the company that needs forgiving. Celeste didn't respond. Her reflection in the glass seemed to ask the one question she couldn't answer. How does a woman who built empires learn to rebuild herself? For weeks, Celeste Arden moved through her days like someone walking underwater. The office no longer felt like hers. The board had reclaimed their confidence, holding private meetings in her absence, rewriting the narrative she had spent years composing. On paper, she was still CEO. In spirit, she had become a rumor in her own company. Lila Rowan's resignation had spread faster than fact. The tabloids printed half-truths disguised as headlines. Young protégé leaves CEO's shadow. Power, love, and scandal in Arden Group. Celeste pretended not to read them, but even Grace Halden could see the hurt hiding beneath her stillness. Every article carved out a piece of her dignity, and yet she faced each day with quiet defiance, refusing to let the world see her bleed. In the evenings, she worked later than ever, surrounded by files she didn't open. The city's glow outside her penthouse no longer felt like victory. It looked like judgment. She would glance at her phone sometimes, hoping for a message from Lila. A small line, a question, even anger. But the screen stayed blank, and that emptiness was louder than any confrontation could be. Meanwhile, across town, Leela was learning the strange ache of getting what she thought she wanted. Aidan Vale welcomed her back with open arms, but there was a distance she couldn't bridge. He spoke of plans and travels, of leaving the corporate grind behind, while she still carried the echo of boardrooms and late-night strategies. She wanted to feel young again, to laugh without consequence. But every time her phone buzzed, she half expected Celeste's name. One evening, while watching the news, she saw a brief segment. Arden Group faces investor turmoil. Celeste appeared for only a second, walking briskly through a crowd of reporters, no words spoken, her face unreadable yet heartbreakingly human. Lila turned off the TV. For a long time she sat in darkness, hands trembling. She had left to save herself, but the guilt of being chosen, and then abandoning the one who chose her, was not something time could easily erase. Somewhere deep in the city's quiet hum, two women carried the same silence for different reasons. One had given too much, the other had taken too little. And between them, admiration had turned into memory. By the end of winter, the storm Celeste Arden had feared finally broke. An internal memo leaked, anonymously, strategically. It claimed favoritism, questioned her leadership, and hinted at unprofessional closeness with a former subordinate. The press devoured it. The next morning, cameras gathered outside Arden Group's glass tower. Reporters shouted her name as she stepped out of her car, her heels steady against the concrete, her expression calm but pale. Grace Halden walked beside her, a silent shield. "Do you deny the rumors?" someone yelled. Celeste didn't flinch. "I built this company on truth. That hasn't changed." But her voice, though poised, carried a tremor only the faithful could hear. Inside, the board convened an emergency session. Charles Denton, the chairman, read from a prepared statement. Formal, impersonal, cruelly polite. "The company requires stability, Miss Arden. We believe it is time for a leadership transition." Celeste nodded once, the gesture dignified but devastating. "I see," she said quietly. "And will stability bring you back your soul?" A hush fell. No one answered. They didn't need to. She signed the papers with the same pen that had once inked million-dollar deals. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and walked out through the hall that had been her kingdom. Outside, the cameras flashed again, freezing her in light. In one of those flashes, Lila Rowan saw her, Not in person, but on a small TV in a cafe. The image struck like lightning. Celeste looked smaller than she remembered, human in a way power had never allowed her to be. Aiden noticed her reaction. "You can't fix this, Lila," he said gently. But Lila wasn't thinking of fixing anything. She was thinking of gratitude unspoken, of promises left hanging between silence and pride. "She stood up for me," Layla murmured, "and I let them tear her down." That night, Leela walked the city streets until the wind turned sharp. She passed Arden Tower, dark now except for one faint light in the top floor. Maybe Celeste was still there, saying her private goodbye. Lila stopped across the street, looking up at that solitary light. Her eyes stung, not from the cold but from recognition. For the first time, she understood what it cost Celeste to choose her, everything, and what it cost her to choose another, peace. The day after her resignation, Celeste Arden returned to the office one last time before dawn. The building's security lights cast long shadows across the marble floor. She moved quietly through the corridor she had once ruled. No entourage, no cameras, no titles left to protect. Her office door was still marked with her name, though she knew by week's end it would be replaced. Inside, the air felt colder. The scent of coffee lingered, faint and comforting. On her desk sat a single envelope, Grace Halden's handwriting on the front, "For when you need to remember who you are." Celeste didn't open it. Some memories were easier to hold unopened. She took one last look at the city from the window. The skyline blinked like a patient heartbeat. Everything she had built was still there, the towers, the deals, the legacy. Only her place within it had vanished. A voice behind her broke the stillness. "They won't remember what you gave them, only what you didn't." It was Grace, standing at the doorway. She looked tired too. Celeste smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering isn't their job anymore. She handed Grace her access card and her gold pen, the one she'd signed every merger with. "Keep these," she said. "One reminds me how to open doors. The other reminds me that I once could." When she finally left the building, dawn was just beginning to rise. Her reflection in the glass doors caught her by surprise. Not the commanding CEO, not the woman who stood against a boardroom full of men. Just Celeste, a woman with gray hair, lined eyes, and a quiet strength the world would never fully understand. That morning, her resignation made headlines. By afternoon, her story had already begun to fade into the next cycle of scandal. But somewhere, beyond all the noise, the city carried her imprint. For those who had truly watched her work, she remained the measure of what integrity costs and what love can undo. Weeks later, when winter settled into the city for good, Lila Rowan stood at the gates of a quiet house overlooking the river. She had tried to move on, to rebuild her life with Aiden Vale, to focus on the smaller, safer dreams he offered. But peace refused to stay. Guilt has a way of finding its voice in the stillness between two people who no longer fit. One morning, she saw Celeste's name on the news again. Not in scandal this time, but in reflection. Arden Legacy, a woman who defied her own board. The article praised her strength, but what Lila saw between the lines was loneliness. It was then she decided to go see her. When Celeste opened the door, surprise crossed her face. The kind of surprise that's too tired to be masked. "Lila," she said softly, "you look well." "I don't feel well," Lila admitted. "I came to say thank you." They stood for a long moment without speaking. The room was warm, the kind of quiet that held both comfort and ache. Celeste motioned toward the window seat, where a stack of books sat beside a cup of untouched tea. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she said. "I wasn't sure I had the right," Lila replied. "You gave me everything, and I ran when it cost too much." Celeste's eyes softened, carrying no trace of anger. "You did what the young are supposed to do. You ran toward your future. I was the one foolish enough to think I could stop time." Lila's throat tightened. "I wish I had been braver." Celeste smiled, a small, sad smile. "Bravery isn't always staying. Sometimes it's walking away before you break something that matters." Outside, the river shimmered in the pale winter light. Neither woman noticed how the distance between them had become less of a wound and more of a bridge. Fragile, but real. Before leaving, Lila placed a folded note on Celeste's table. "For when you forget what you saved in me," she whispered. When Celeste opened it later, there were only 6 words. "You made me believe I could." For the first time in months, Celeste let herself cry, quietly, freely. Not for loss, but for proof that something beautiful had lived in the space between them. In the weeks that followed, Celeste Arden began to rediscover the rhythm of ordinary life. She woke without meetings, without headlines, without the hum of decisions waiting to be made. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly became her sanctuary. Every morning, she took her coffee on the porch overlooking the river, wrapped in an old cashmere shawl. The world no longer asked anything of her, and for the first time, she could simply watch it move. But peace is never complete when there are still words unsaid. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she sat at her desk and began to write a letter she would never send. Dear Lila, I spent too long building walls and calling them standards. You made me remember that courage doesn't always wear a suit. It sometimes walks in with doubt and hope in the same breath. The world mistook my choice for weakness, but it was the only time I chose something human over something profitable. I don't regret it. I hope, when you stand where I once stood, you'll choose love without shame and ambition without apology. Celeste. She folded the letter neatly and placed it inside a small wooden box beside Grace Halden's unopened envelope. For her, it wasn't about closure, it was about truth, finally having a place to rest. That evening, Grace visited with 2 cups of tea. They offered to name the new headquarters after you, she said gently. Arden Tower. They're trying to make peace with history. Celeste smiled faintly. History doesn't need my name, it needs women like Lila to rewrite it. As dusk settled, she felt a strange calm, a release she hadn't known she was holding. She watched the lights flicker across the river and whispered into the night, "We were both right in our own ways." The wind carried her words away, and for the first time in years, she didn't reach to pull them back. Spring came quietly that year. The city bloomed in slow colors, and with it, the stories people once obsessed over began to fade. Arden Group moved on under new leadership. The headlines turned to fresher scandals. But for those who remembered, the name Celeste Arden remained a symbol, not of failure, but of the kind of strength that chooses compassion over control. Lila Rowan had left corporate life altogether. She now worked for a small nonprofit that helped young women find their footing in business. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Sometimes, when she gave advice to those just starting out, she caught herself repeating Celeste's words. Vision is what builds, not fear. Aiden Vale still called occasionally, but their conversations were polite now, hollow. The fire that once bound them had cooled into something kinder, a memory, not a promise. One afternoon, as Lila sorted through old papers, she found a card she'd written months earlier but never mailed. On the front was a watercolor of a sunrise over glass towers. Inside, just one sentence. You taught me how to stand tall, even when the world sits in judgment. She smiled softly, slipped it into an envelope, and sent it anyway, addressed not to a person but to a place. Arden House, Riverside. A week later, Celeste found it in her mailbox. She read it under the same tree where she'd once drafted her farewell letter, and for a long time she simply breathed. There was no ache left, only gratitude. In that stillness, she realized that legacy isn't measured in headlines or profits, but in the quiet ways we leave people braver than we found them. She looked toward the river, its surface glimmering like liquid glass, and whispered to herself, "Some choices break us, some rebuild us, and the rare ones do both." As the sun dipped low, Celeste closed her eyes and smiled, not at what was lost, but at what had quietly endured. Because even love that doesn't last can still leave something unbreakable behind. As the river shimmered in the evening light, Celeste Arden finally understood what all her years at the top had never taught her. That love, in its truest form, doesn't always arrive to stay. Sometimes it comes only to remind us that our hearts are still capable of choosing, even when logic says not to. She had lost her title, her company, her public standing. Yet somewhere in the quiet between loss and renewal, she had found something the world could never take. Peace. And maybe that's the secret life never tells us, that the end of one story isn't the closing of a door, but the soft turning of a page. Because what remains isn't power or legacy or even love itself. It's the courage to have felt deeply, even when it cost you everything. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Celeste Arden's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Celeste Arden's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.